I'm Avery Hartmans with the News House, and I'm here with Billy Collins, former U.S. Poet Laureate. So Billy, what I want to know first is, how did you get your start with poetry?
My start? Well, I actually heard poetry in my house when I was growing up because my mother had memorized a lot of poetry. And so she would stitch some poetry into her conversation. Just any circumstance, she'd have some little poem or some lines for it. So it was really cold out. I remember she would say, "Blow, blow, thou winter wind, thou art not so unkind as man's ingratitude," from Shakespeare. So she wasn't a real literary person. She didn't go to college. But as a schoolgirl, she just had all this memorization, these poems memorized in her head. And so even before I think I knew the word poetry, I knew that my mother had two ways of talking. She had this regular way of talking, and then she had this better way of talking. So I recognized this other way of talking as a better, more pleasant form of language.
Do you remember the first poem you ever wrote?
Well, I remember writing it. I don't remember the poem. I remember being in the back of my parents' car. Now, I don't know if you're an only child or not.
I have 3 sisters.
Okay, well then this is lost on you. However, to the only children out there, if you're an only child, the back of your parents' car is your domain. You don't have to fight over space. There's no one annoying you. It's your spot. So riding along up the East Side Highway, which is called the FDR now, I saw a sailboat in the East River. And I asked my mother for something to write on. I had some kind of literary response to this. I don't know what I wrote, but I do remember seeing something and then wanting to write something about it, which is since Wordsworth has been the basic motivation for poetry. You see something and you want to say something about it. For Wordsworth, it was daffodils. For me, it was a sailboat.
So is that how you generally get inspired? You see something, it makes you think of something else, you write a poem?
Yeah, you see something or you hear something or you read something. Before the poem, there's always a trigger. I mean, it doesn't just come from sitting around musing or stargazing or navel gazing. There's some stimulus sets off a trigger, and if you've written poetry long enough, you get to recognize true triggers from false triggers, so that you can recognize that an idea, an observation, a line from a book, an overheard bit of conversation has potential, and then you work on the potential.
So can you tell me a little bit more about your term as Poet Laureate, both for the U.S. and for New York State? I know that you were Poet Laureate for the U.S. for 2 terms, and I was wondering, how did your life change when you became Poet Laureate, and how did your poetry change, if it did? Poetry
came to a halt because of the other life changes, which were basically being interviewed to death. I mean, what we're doing now was the cause of the end of my writing, basically, because you become a public figure. I mean, you can hide. I mean, you can run, but you can't hide. In this case, you can run and you can hide, but there's a kind of expectation that you will represent poetry during your term. And that means being a public figure, and that means being interviewed, and that means being publicly consulted and giving lectures and that kind of thing. So yeah, so it's a public service, I'd say. It's a nice thing to have. I mean, it's good for your self-esteem, After all, you're the United States Poet Laureate. Well, here you are, You're buying a newspaper, having a cup of coffee, but it's the United States Poet Laureate having a cup of coffee. So there's you can kind of rely on that for a bit of extra self-esteem. But it also reveals something about our country, I guess, that we don't have a ballet laureate or an opera laureate, or a short story laureate. It says something about the history of poetry and how it tends to intersect with public life at times.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It was so nice to meet you, and we'd love to have you at Syracuse.
Great. You're very welcome.